There are days when the mirror doesn't reflect anymore. It waits, still, muted, like it knows you don't want to see yourself. Not really. Not the version you've become, not the pieces you left behind. You walk past your own reflection as if it doesn't matter. You brush your teeth, you fix your hair, but the eyes, they don't meet, they avoid, they lower, they scan for something, anything that might still look like you. But something got quiet inside. Too quiet. Not peaceful. Not serene. Just absent. As if the wind that once filled your chest no longer rises in your lungs. As if the echo of who you were faded before you even noticed. And the strangest part? No one sees it. You laugh at the right moments. You answer every message. You perform. But somewhere, beneath the surface, you've stopped believing in yourself. You wouldn't say it out loud. You wouldn't dare. But it lives in the way you hesitate before starting anything new. It lives in the pauses between your thoughts. It lives in the way you explain yourself to people who never asked you to. There is a kind of tired that doesn't sleep. It just waits, sits in the back of your mind, counting the number of times you said, "I'm fine." Maybe that's why you're here. Not by accident, not by curiosity, but because something in you still hears the sound of your own absence. That faint, flickering voice that says, "You used to believe in yourself. What happened?" This isn't a motivational video. It's not a speech. It's a return, a quiet one, sharp, uncomfortable, like staring into a room you've kept locked for years, and realizing you were the one holding the key the whole time. You weren't always this tired. You weren't always this doubtful. There was a time when you didn't explain your presence. You just arrived, you just were. This video won't give you formulas. It won't hand you empty affirmations, but it will whisper truths, the kind you already know, but were afraid to feel. And if you stay long enough, you might remember. You might remember the weight of your own spine, the fire in your silence, the strength in your unspoken no. Because somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the shame, the guilt, the weariness, you still exist. Not the polished version, not the version others prefer, but the real one, the one who doesn't need to be liked or praised or understood, just whole and quiet and here. So sit with this, not as content, but as confrontation. Let it sting, let it echo, let it remind you of the man or woman you were before you started doubting the sound of your own voice. Because believing in yourself doesn't start with words. It starts with remembering that you were never as lost as you thought, just silent, too silent. And now that silence ends, sometimes the silence doesn't come from peace, it comes from disappearance, not loud, not dramatic, just unnoticed. You begin to pull away, not from others, but from yourself. You stop checking in. You stop asking how you feel. You stop showing up in the mirror with the same fire you once had. And instead of mourning that loss, you normalize it. You call it maturity. You call it humility. You call it growing up. But somewhere deep down, you know, something essential has gone quiet. Maybe it started small. You held your tongue once to avoid a fight. Then again, to keep the peace. Then again, because your voice felt heavy, until silence became survival. And at first, you wore it like armor, controlled, stoic maybe, but it wasn't. It was resignation, a slow fading that no one noticed, because you didn't scream. You became the one who smiled in discomfort, who said, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. You performed strength but forgot what it felt like to actually carry it inside. And then came the echo of all the things you wanted to say but never did. The echo of all the versions of yourself you buried just to make others comfortable. This is what happens when you silence yourself to fit into spaces that were never built to hold you. You start disappearing even when you're still in the room. People say you've changed. You have. but not in the way they think. You didn't evolve, you shrank, you adjusted, you amputated pieces of your soul to stay agreeable. And now you wonder why your reflection feels like a stranger. You wonder why motivation doesn't land anymore, why praise doesn't move you, why you feel empty even on the most beautiful days. It's because your silence has become a cage, not the noble kind, not the strong and quiet type, but the kind that suffocates truth and calls it maturity. No one told you that disappearing can happen in slow motion, that you can lose yourself not in trauma, but in repetition, in the daily erosion of not choosing yourself. And the most painful part, you got good at it. You got good at abandoning yourself, good at making it look graceful, good at pretending that letting go of your voice was wisdom. But now you're here, which means something in you is stirring again. Something in you is remembering the sound of your own name when spoken without apology. This part of the video isn't meant to inspire. It's meant to disturb, to peel back the numbness, to awaken that quiet grief you stopped acknowledging. Because the truth is this: you didn't lose yourself, you silenced yourself, and silence, when built on fear, is not peace, it's absence, and you were never meant to live in absence. You didn't wake up one day and decide to vanish. It was slower than that, quieter. It began with a single choice, one small moment where you didn't speak your truth, because it felt inconvenient, because it might disappoint someone, because it was easier to be quiet than to be questioned. And you told yourself, just this once, but the once became often, and the often became always, until one day, your truth wasn't loud anymore. It was barely a whisper, barely alive. You became agreeable, predictable, safe. But safe isn't the same as strong, and agreeable isn't the same as alive. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being someone you could trust, not because you lied, but because you hid from yourself. You lowered your voice until it became background noise in your own life. And the cost of that, it's not obvious at first, it's subtle. You lose color, you lose depth, you lose that unmistakable feeling of being undeniably you. You go to bed full of unspoken thoughts. You wake up with a heaviness you can't name. You look in the mirror and feel the weight of all the things you no longer fight for. That's not growth, that's erosion. You didn't stop dreaming because life got hard. You stopped because something inside you decided you were too much, too intense, too emotional, too loud. And so you shrank piece by piece, not to survive, but to be palatable. You became careful, measured, almost invisible. You call it discipline, you call it being realistic. But deep down, you know, you were made for more than quiet resignation. The worst part isn't the silence. It's forgetting that your voice ever mattered. It's convincing yourself that fading away was a noble choice. It wasn't. It was fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being too much. Fear of taking up space you thought you hadn't earned. But hear this, you don't need permission to return to yourself. Not from the world. Not from the past. Not even from your own shame. The door back to you has always been unlocked. You just stopped reaching for the handle. And maybe now, for the first time in a long time, you're ready to touch it again. Not with rage, not with guilt, but with clarity. The clarity that says, I'm still here. Not as I was, but as I am. Unexplained, unapologetic, undeniable. And maybe that's where strength begins again, not in noise, not in performance, but in the quiet decision to stop abandoning yourself for the comfort of others. Because self-trust isn't built through silence, it's built through return. And return is always possible, even now. You've spent so long adapting, you forgot what standing still feels like. Not frozen, but rooted. There's a difference, and you're only now beginning to feel it. Because when you adapt too much, you don't become better. You become vague, a blur, a version of yourself that fits everywhere but belongs nowhere. You adjusted your tone to match the room. You softened your edges until nothing sharp remained. But here's the truth no one told you. Edges exist for a reason. They hold shape, they define boundaries, they protect what matters. And when you sand them down, you don't become kinder. You become easier to ignore. People stop asking what you think because they already know you'll just agree. They stop wondering how you feel because you've trained them to expect nothing loud from you. You taught the world how to treat your silence, and now you wonder why no one listens. But the question isn't, why don't they hear me? The real question is, why did I stop speaking in the first place? It wasn't because you had nothing to say. It was because you didn't think your truth deserved space. That's the fracture. That's the wound. Not the absence of voice, but the belief that your voice would cost too much. So you saved it, you stored it, you swallowed it until your own inner life became too dense to carry. And now, that weight, it shows up in strange ways. Fatigue you can't explain. Restlessness that has no source, a constant hum of dissatisfaction you try to numb with distractions. But it's not life that's exhausting you. It's the effort of hiding who you are, every single day. And no, you don't need to shout. You don't need to explode. This isn't about volume, it's about presence. Can you sit with yourself fully, without flinching? Can you return to your original shape without apologizing for how much space it takes? Because the silence you built, it was a shield, but shields get heavy, and you've carried this one for too long. The moment has come to put it down, not to be reckless, but to be real, to be the kind of quiet that doesn't shrink, but commands. The kind that speaks without needing noise, the kind that simply by existing says, I remember who I am, and I am done vanishing. You didn't stop believing in yourself overnight. It was a slow unraveling, invisible, incremental, not caused by one moment, but by hundreds of small concessions. You gave up little pieces of yourself to be understood, to be accepted, to be loved, each time thinking, this one won't matter. But they added up. Until one day, you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. This isn't about failure. This isn't about weakness. It's about erosion. The kind that happens when you trade your essence for safety. And safety isn't always safe. Sometimes it's the most dangerous place to live, because in safety, you stop taking risks. You stop raising your hand. You stop standing your ground. You avoid discomfort. But you also avoid growth. You keep yourself small to stay untouched. But untouched things never feel the fire of life, and that's the cost. You wanted peace, but you paid with presence. You wanted harmony, but you gave up your edge. You wanted to be liked, and in the process, forgot how it feels to like yourself. That's where the break happened, quietly. You became someone who tiptoes around your own truth, someone who crafts every word so it lands softly in the ears of others. But when was the last time you spoke in a way that landed deeply in you? When did you stop writing your story in your own ink? Because here's the truth no one likes to admit. Believing in yourself isn't some glowing feeling of confidence. It's not loud. It's not obvious. It's subtle. Steady, almost silent. It's in the decisions you make when no one's watching. It's in the boundaries you hold even when they make others uncomfortable. It's in the way you show up for yourself when applause is absent. You don't need others to see your worth for it to exist. You don't need validation to return to your spine. But you do need honesty. Honesty about how far you've drifted. Honesty about the ways you've betrayed yourself. Honesty about the quiet ache you feel when you say yes, but mean no. This video won't fix you. It's not meant to, because you're not broken. You're buried beneath layers of performance, of politeness, of pretending, but even now you're breathing. And breath means permission to begin again, to return, to reclaim, not in one giant leap, but in one silent decision. I'm done living a life that demands I forget who I am just to be accepted, because acceptance means nothing if it costs your soul. And belief, true belief, doesn't shout. It whispers, I'm still here. Believing in yourself doesn't begin with confidence, it begins with discomfort. The kind that creeps in when you realize how long you've lived trying to avoid your own depth. You've dressed yourself in other people's expectations for so long that you forgot the shape of your own outline. You were not meant to be a collection of other people's preferences. You were not meant to filter your soul just to make your presence easier to digest. But you did, because you thought that being loved meant being less. You started editing yourself. First in conversations, then in relationships, then in your own thoughts. You replaced honesty with strategy. You replaced desire with duty. You replaced your truth with whatever version of you got the least resistance. And for a while, it worked. People liked you. You got along. You didn't ruffle feathers. But deep inside, a quiet war began. One side of you kept smiling, kept nodding, kept agreeing. The other side, the truer side, started to suffocate. Not because it was weak, but because it was ignored. You see, neglect doesn't only happen in relationships. It happens inside, when you choose comfort over truth, when you choose harmony over wholeness, when you choose being liked over being real. That's how belief erodes, not through failure, through silence. You stop standing up for yourself. You stop dreaming with clarity. You stop protecting your own energy until belief in yourself becomes a memory instead of a force. But here's the quiet truth. You don't need to feel worthy to act like you are. You don't need to feel strong to begin walking upright. You don't need to wait for certainty to begin rebuilding your spine. Because belief isn't always a flame. Sometimes it's a decision. A small, firm, whispered choice in the middle of doubt. The kind that says, I am tired of abandoning myself to make others comfortable. I am tired of keeping the peace at the cost of my voice. I'm tired of performing a version of me that looks alive but feels hollow. That moment, that tired, quiet awakening is where real belief begins. Not the kind you post about, not the kind you announce, the kind you carry when no one else sees, the kind that rebuilds you not from the outside in, but from the inside up. And you'll notice it, not in grand gestures, but in quiet shifts. You'll say no without explaining. You'll choose rest without guilt. You'll speak a truth without bracing for impact. You'll walk away not to punish anyone, but to return to yourself. That's belief. That's how it sounds, how it lives, how it grows. Not through loud declarations, but through silent alignment. And slowly, steadily, you remember, you were never too much. You were never broken. You were just waiting for permission to stop pretending. And now you don't need it. There is a moment in every life when the pretending starts to crack. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in the smallest ways. You pause longer before saying yes. You feel tired after conversations that once felt effortless. You begin to notice how much energy it takes to be who you've become. That's the moment belief begins to stir again. Not loudly, not confidently, but deeply, like a seed under the ground breaking through in silence. Because real belief, the kind that rebuilds a human being, isn't forged in comfort. It's born in confrontation. And the first thing it confronts is the mask, the one you built to survive, to succeed, to stay in control. You built it well. You made it likable, capable, safe. But no mask, no matter how perfect, can carry your soul. Eventually, it slips. And when it does, you start to see the parts of yourself you left behind in the name of being accepted. You remember your old boldness, your natural edge, the raw fire that once lived in your words before you sanded them down to be digestible. And in that memory, something inside you aches, not for the past, but for permission to return, to rebuild, not the image, but the essence. Belief is not about becoming more. It's about shedding the fake peace, shedding the quiet guilt, shedding the smile you force onto your face every time you abandon your truth. And in that shedding, you reclaim something essential: dignity, not the kind others give you. The kind you give yourself when you stop apologizing for existing on your own terms. That's when you begin to breathe differently, deeper, slower, truer, because the weight you've been carrying was never yours. It was the weight of approval, the weight of performance, the weight of keeping everyone else comfortable while you slowly disappeared. And now you're done with that. Not because you're angry, not because you want revenge, but because you're finally tired in the right way. Tired of self-betrayal, tired of shrinking, tired of being understood by people who never took the time to truly see you. So what now? Now you begin quietly, not with goals, not with resolutions, but with one honest sentence. You sit with yourself and you say, I want to come home, not to a place, not to a role, but to a self that no longer needs justification. That's belief, raw, unfiltered, still bruised maybe, but breathing. And once that belief returns, even in fragments, you begin to move through the world with a different gravity. People will feel it, not because you're louder, but because you're real. And in a world that rewards the performance, that's power. Sometimes it's not the pain that breaks you, it's the numbness, the slow drift into a version of yourself that feels functional. You go through the motions, you keep the calendar full, you meet expectations, but inside, you're quiet. Not peacefully quiet, but quietly gone. This is what happens when the world applauds your mask and you begin to believe it's your real face. You stop questioning, you stop exploring, you stop feeling, and that's when you begin to vanish, still standing, still present but emotionally evicted from your own life, and no one sees it, because you've become a master of fine. But fine is not a life. Fine is not belief. Fine is a waiting room. For the moment you finally remember, you were never meant to live as a shadow of yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. The awakening, it happens in fragments. You hear a line that cuts deep. You read something that feels like it was written from the wound inside you. You look in the mirror and feel tired of pretending. And in that moment, you don't cry, you don't rage, you just feel done. Done explaining, done adjusting, done twisting your truth into shapes that make other people comfortable enough to stay. You begin to realize that belief isn't about being strong. It's about being honest. And honesty is brutal when you've built a life around denial. When you've spent years polishing the surface while the foundation rotted in silence. But here's the truth. You are not obligated to keep being the person you became just to survive. You are allowed to walk away from the version of you that everyone else loves, if it no longer feels like home. That's not betrayal. That's rebirth. And yes, it's terrifying, because rebuilding your self-belief means facing everything you've tried to outrun, the disappointments, the rejections, the ways you abandoned yourself while chasing approval. But there's freedom there, in the fire, in the mirror, in the honest reckoning with your own choices. Because what you'll find under the ruins of performance is a voice that never stopped whispering, remember who you were before you became who they wanted? That voice is still there. And it's not angry, it's not bitter, it's patient, waiting for you to stop running, to stop bending, to stop apologizing for needing to be whole again. Self-belief is not a mood, it's not a high, it's not a peak state you chase. It's a return to dignity, to values, to the clarity that says, I don't owe the world a watered-down version of myself just so I can be tolerated. You weren't born to be tolerated. You were born to carry your own weight with quiet authority. And that begins when you stop handing out pieces of yourself like favors to people who never asked for the real you. From here on out, every act of honesty is belief. Every boundary you set is belief. Every time you say no without guilt, that's belief. Even if your hands shake, even if your voice cracks, even if you have to rebuild from the bones of who you used to be, there is no perfect return, only presence, and that is enough. There's a moment when you stop chasing healing and start choosing alignment. Not because the pain is gone, but because you're tired of organizing your life around it. You begin to notice the small fractures, the tiny betrayals you commit against yourself every time you say yes, just to avoid confrontation. Every time you stay silent to keep the peace. Every time you show up with a smile when your soul is begging you to disappear for a while. These aren't just habits, they're patterns, and they cost more than you think. Because every moment you override your own truth for the sake of someone else's comfort, you teach yourself that your needs are negotiable, that your voice is optional, that your existence is flexible. But belief doesn't grow in that kind of soil. Belief needs clarity. It needs presence. It needs a spine, even if it trembles, even if it's unsure. Because here's the quiet secret. You don't rebuild belief by becoming fearless. You rebuild it by acting while afraid, by choosing yourself when everything in you has been trained to fold. This doesn't mean becoming hard. It doesn't mean becoming cold. It means becoming whole, no longer splitting yourself between who you are and who the world expects you to be. No longer apologizing for the intensity of your presence or the quietness of your soul, because you've spent enough time trying to make yourself palatable to people who never asked for the real you in the first place. And now, you want something real. Not applause, not approval, not followers, just truth, just silence that isn't empty, just a life that feels like it fits when no one else is looking. That's belief. And the path to it isn't glamorous, it's raw, it's quiet. It's full of endings you didn't want to face, like letting go of people you once needed approval from, like saying goodbye to the roles that gave you identity but stole your aliveness, like choosing solitude over company that drains you. This is the work no one claps for, but it's the only work that will ever matter, because there's no external solution to an internal abandonment. There's no relationship, no opportunity, no title that can replace the integrity of standing fully in your own skin. You will be misunderstood. You will be questioned. You will be doubted. Let them. You're not here to explain, you're here to embody the version of you that no longer folds to fit, that no longer shrinks to be safe, that no longer hides when the truth asks to be spoken. This is where belief lives now, not in the eyes of others, but in your decisions, in your tone, in the way you walk away from anything that costs you your peace. And you may still feel fear. That's okay. Fear doesn't mean stop, it means pay attention. And when you do, you'll notice something. Underneath the fear, there's still you, intact, aware, ready, not for perfection, not for performance, but for presence, for life lived on your terms, in your rhythm, at your volume. And that, quietly, is everything. Most people don't abandon themselves all at once. It's not a collapse. It's a surrender. Subtle, incremental, unnoticed, even by you. You compromise once, then again, until the compromises become your personality. You start saying, I don't mind, even when you do. You say, it's fine, even when it isn't. You nod when your soul is screaming no. And over time, your truth becomes diluted, watered down, unclear, not because you lack conviction, but because you've forgotten what it feels like to speak from the center of yourself. That's what belief is. Not certainty, but center. A place inside you that does not sway with the approval of others. A place that remains calm even when your voice shakes. But you've been away from that place. Not because you're weak, but because you were taught that pleasing others is safer than being true, and maybe it was, at some point. Maybe it kept you connected, protected, loved, but now it's costing too much. Because each time you abandon your truth to keep the peace, you declare silently, "I don't trust myself." And belief cannot live where self-trust has died. So how do you return? Not with answers, not with a plan, but with space. Space to feel what you've avoided, space to listen without editing, space to meet yourself where you are, not where you think you should be. And in that space, you'll hear it. The quiet hum of your unbroken voice, still there, still intact, still waiting to be honored. Not by performance, not by perfection, but by presence. That's all it ever needed. But presence is hard when you've been busy surviving, when you've used achievement as anesthesia, when you've used relationships as distraction, when you've used silence as a shield. So this is not a call to action, it's a call to attention, to the breath, to the body, to the part of you that never forgot what it feels like to belong to yourself. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to be honest. You don't need to be whole. You just need to stop abandoning the parts of you that aren't. You don't need to go faster. You need to stop running. Running from grief. Running from stillness. Running from the fear that if you slowed down, you'd realize how far you've drifted. But distance doesn't erase worth. Even if you've been away for years, you're still allowed to come back, without apology, without punishment, without begging for forgiveness from a version of yourself that was just doing the best it could. This is what belief looks like now. A soft return, a slow walk back to the truth you buried under performance. A steady decision to stop explaining your worth to people who were never meant to understand it. You are not too late. You are not too far gone. You are not too broken. You are just ready. Ready to rebuild belief, not as a feeling, but as a way of living. Quiet, unshakable, yours. Sometimes the loudest disconnection in your life is not between you and others, but between you and yourself. You talk about peace, you speak of clarity, you chase discipline, but underneath it all, there's an internal contradiction, a gap between what you know and what you live, between the wisdom you've gathered and the choices you make when no one is watching. You tell yourself you want to change, but still you repeat. You tell yourself you've grown, but still you tolerate what drains you. That's not weakness, that's conditioning. You've been trained to endure, to be the bigger person, to be understanding. But what if understanding others kept you from ever understanding yourself? What if you've misused compassion as a tool for self-erasure? You call it patience, you call it empathy, but deep down, you know it's fear. Fear of rejection, fear of disconnection, fear of being alone with yourself and having to face what's really there. So you fill the silence with people, with opinions, with noise disguised as connection. But none of it sticks because nothing external can soothe the ache of being divorced from your own truth. You could be in a room full of love and still feel abandoned if you're not in integrity with your own soul. And belief, true belief, requires integrity, not moral perfection, not flawless execution, but alignment, a quiet knowing that your words and your life are finally speaking the same language. And when they don't, you feel it. You feel the heaviness. You feel the guilt that doesn't have a name. You feel the discomfort that creeps in every time you say yes, just to keep the peace. It doesn't matter how much you accomplish if you abandon yourself to do it. It doesn't matter how kind you appear if your kindness is just a mask for fear of confrontation. At some point, you must choose peace or permission, because the version of you that everyone praises might be the same version that's slowly killing your spirit. That's the paradox no one talks about. You can be successful, admired, stable, and still be spiritually starving, because belief isn't about the image, it's about the root. What anchors you when everything else is gone? What remains when the applause fades? What lives in your silence? That's where your belief is hiding, in the place no one sees, not in your habits, not in your routines, not in the carefully curated story you tell the world, but in the stillness where you stop pretending. And most people never go there. They're too afraid of what they'll find. But not you. You're here, which means you're ready. Ready to trade performance for presence. Ready to let go of almost. Ready to stop living half-truths in exchange for full integrity. Even if it costs you comfort. Even if it costs you connection. Because what you'll gain is something deeper. A life that doesn't contradict you. A rhythm that doesn't exhaust you. A self you can finally trust. Belief isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fanfare or lightning. It returns quietly. In the smallest moments, moments no one notices, but you feel them. When you tell the truth, even when it shakes the room. When you stop chasing clarity from others and begin cultivating it inside yourself. When you walk away, not out of anger, but out of alignment. That's belief, and it's harder than it sounds, because we're trained to explain ourselves, to soften the truth, to prioritize harmony over honesty. But harmony built on self-erasure is not peace. It's a slow kind of death. You smile in the photo, you show up to the meeting, you say no problem as your chest tightens. You keep showing up for the life you've built, even when it no longer reflects the life you truly want, and no one can see it, because you've mastered the performance, but inside, you're exhausted. Exhausted from overthinking, exhausted from adjusting, exhausted from being someone you never intended to become. You thought discipline was enough. You thought consistency would save you. You thought success would fill the hole. But belief isn't built on achievements, it's built on alignment. And alignment doesn't mean you're always doing the right thing. It means you're willing to stop lying to yourself about what isn't working. That's where it begins, in radical honesty. When you look in the mirror and finally say, this isn't who I want to be anymore. And instead of spiraling into guilt, you pause, you breathe, you make a different choice. Maybe not a perfect one, but a truer one. And in that choice, something shifts. You feel your feet again, you remember your spine, you hear your voice, not the one crafted for acceptance, but the one that doesn't tremble anymore. Not because it's loud, but because it's whole. And people will notice. Some will be confused. Some will pull away. Let them. You're not changing for applause. You're realigning for survival, for peace, for presence. Not everyone is meant to walk with you in this new chapter, because this version of you is different, rooted, sharp, unwilling to betray yourself just to maintain a bond. And yes, it will be lonely at first. But solitude in truth is better than company in disguise. Because now you don't need noise to feel important. You don't need chaos to feel alive. You don't need attention to validate your existence. You've made it back to yourself. And even if that self is bruised, even if it's tender, it's yours, fully, finally. And now, every step forward isn't a performance, it's a declaration. I will no longer sacrifice my clarity for comfort. I will no longer trade my intuition for instructions. I will no longer apologize for being whole. That's what belief feels like. Not invincible, but unshakable. Because when your soul and your steps finally agree, you don't walk. You move through the world with silent, unstoppable certainty. You don't need to fight for your worth. You only need to stop negotiating it, because somewhere along the path, you were taught that value must be earned, that you need to prove yourself, to deserve love, to deserve space, to deserve peace. But worth is not a transaction. It's not a prize. It's a fact, one you forgot. Because the world is loud about who you should be, but painfully silent when you start to drift away from who you really are. You kept showing up, you kept performing, and somewhere in that rhythm, you forgot how to simply be. That's the tragedy no one talks about. How easy it is to succeed while abandoning your soul, and how long it takes to feel that absence. At first, it looks like fatigue. Then it sounds like overthinking. Eventually, it becomes this quiet ache you can't explain, only feel, a constant hum beneath everything. You try to silence it with more effort, more kindness, more compliance, but it only grows, because it's not asking you to do more. It's asking you to come back to the center, back to the quiet knowing that you were never meant to be convenient. You were meant to be complete, and that completeness requires boundaries, not walls, boundaries. The quiet decision to stop pouring yourself into every empty space that calls itself connection. The quiet strength to stop performing availability as if it were love. The quiet truth that says, if I lose someone for being myself, they were never really mine. This is the kind of clarity that breaks things, illusions, patterns, attachments, but let them break. Not all endings are tragedy. Some are resurrection. Because with every layer you shed, with every no you speak, with every version of you that dies to make space for the real one, you come closer to the man or woman who walks differently, talks slower, breathes deeper, not because they have all the answers, but because they've stopped pretending. And in that quiet, a new kind of life begins. One where you no longer explain your silence, or decorate your pain, or filter your depth to be accepted by shallow minds. You don't need to be soft to be kind. You don't need to be agreeable to be good. You don't need to shrink to be loved. Those are myths told by those who are terrified of presence. But you're not anymore. You've tasted your own absence. You've felt what it's like to abandon yourself in slow motion, and now you're done with that. Not because you're angry, but because you're finally awake. There's no going back now. Because once you've remembered what it feels like to breathe in alignment, to walk without folding, to sit in your own presence without needing to justify it, you realize this is the life you were always meant to live. Unrushed, unfiltered, unapologetically yours, not perfect but true. And in this truth, you don't need motivation. You don't need permission. You don't even need understanding. You just need stillness and the courage to stay there. There is a difference between silence that heals and silence that hides. You've known both. One feels like exhale, the other feels like erasure. You learned early that not every truth is welcome, that honesty has a cost, that being fully seen can make people leave. So you adapted. You measured your words, you read the room before you entered it, you rehearsed your personality so no one would flinch, and it worked. On the surface, you became reliable, respected, liked. But under it all, you vanished. Because truth doesn't survive in places that require you to edit your essence. It withers, quietly, until even you forget what it sounds like. That's what this journey is about. Not becoming someone new, but remembering, returning, rebuilding the bridge between your soul and your voice. Belief isn't born in inspiration, it's born in confrontation. When you stop negotiating with your own reflection, when you stop trying to win back people who were only drawn to your silence, and you begin to see the version of you they loved wasn't you. It was a shadow, a softened echo, a diluted presence designed to make others stay. But you're not here to be agreeable. You're here to be aligned. And alignment will cost you, not just comfort, but illusion. Because you'll have to let go of the narratives that kept you small, that you must always explain yourself, that you owe the world clarity, that your value rises and falls based on how easy you are to understand. No, you are allowed to be complex. You are allowed to outgrow people. You are allowed to choose silence not as retreat, but as command. That kind of silence doesn't shrink you. It stabilizes you. It says, I know who I am. I don't need to perform it for your approval. And from that place, everything changes. You begin to see what no longer belongs. Conversations that drain, habits that numb, roles that limit. And you begin to release, Not because you hate what was, but because you love what could be, and belief becomes your anchor, not belief in outcomes, not belief in control, but belief in your ability to stay with yourself when the room gets quiet, to stay with yourself when no one is clapping, to stay with yourself when growth feels like loss. That's the discipline no one teaches. The inner rigor of being loyal to your own soul, even when it would be easier to disappear again. But you won't. Not now, not this time, because you've seen what that costs, and finally you've decided you're no longer available for your own self-betrayal. It takes strength to rebuild belief when what you lost wasn't taken, but given. Given in moments you said yes when you meant no. Given in all the times you laughed just to fill the silence. Given in the spaces where you chose to be understood instead of being real. No one stole your power. You handed it away, bit by bit, without realizing what it was worth, until now. Now you see the empty shelves where your boundaries used to be. Now you feel the echo in conversations that leave you hollow. Now you notice how much you've shaped yourself around other people's comfort instead of your own clarity. That's not weakness, that's human. But knowing it, really knowing it, requires you to stop pretending you're just tired. You're not just tired, you're unaligned, you're unfinished, you're unspoken. And belief doesn't return through rest alone. It returns when you pick up every abandoned part of yourself and say, I see you. You don't need to hide anymore. You begin to remember the times you silenced your intuition because it didn't sound logical. You recall the people you let stay too long because leaving felt rude. You revisit the dreams you shelved because you thought you had to earn the right to pursue them. All of that, every sacrifice of your inner truth, was a quiet way of saying, I don't trust me yet. But now you're learning to trust again, not by proving, not by achieving, but by standing still when every pattern inside you screams to run. You stay. In discomfort, in uncertainty, in silence, and that stillness starts to feel less like a void and more like a home. Because for the first time in years, you're not rushing to escape yourself. That's the beginning. That's the rebirth. And from there, you become dangerous again, not in the way the world fears, but in the way that says, I will no longer abandon myself to be understood by others. You don't explain the new boundary, you hold it. You don't argue your new pace, you walk it. You don't justify your clarity, you embody it. And people will feel that shift, they'll call it change, they'll call it distance. But you'll know it's return. The return to the version of you that was never afraid to be whole. Even if it meant walking alone, even if it meant being misunderstood, even if it meant losing things you once prayed to keep. Because nothing you lose while being honest is truly a loss. It's release. And belief, real belief, only lives where you've made space for it. Space that isn't crowded by apology, by compromise, by noise. So make space, not by force, but by refusal. Refusal to keep explaining your worth. Refusal to keep shrinking for comfort. Refusal to keep silencing a voice that was never meant to whisper. This is your life. And it begins again. Here, in the stillness, in the breath, in the quiet clarity that says, I'm not here to be tolerated, I'm here to be true. There comes a point where you no longer crave to be understood. You crave to be whole. You stop explaining. You stop defending. You stop crafting versions of yourself to make people stay. Because the truth is, the ones who need you to explain are rarely the ones who truly see you, and the ones who truly see you don't need the explanation. They recognize the language of presence, of stillness, of self-respect. And that's what you're learning now. You don't owe the world a digestible version of your journey. You owe yourself truth. You owe yourself the courage to speak, even when your voice has grown quiet from years of neglect. You owe yourself the dignity to walk away, even when it feels like failure. Because staying in the wrong place just to avoid being alone is the most painful way to disappear. and disappearing is no longer an option. You've done that already. You know how it feels to fade while smiling, to ache while functioning, to vanish behind a persona that everyone admires, but you can no longer carry. So, you let go. You stop trying to maintain what no longer reflects you. You stop decorating the prison and finally walk toward the door that's been open this entire time. And as you do, the silence around you changes. It stops feeling like absence. It starts feeling like alignment, because belief doesn't make noise. It makes peace. A peace that isn't passive, a peace that isn't quiet submission, a peace that stands, unmoved, unafraid, unbothered by misunderstanding. You begin to measure your life not by how much you achieve, but by how much you remain intact in every room you enter. Not by how many approve, but by how little you compromise. Not by how busy you are, but by how present you feel when you're alone with your own thoughts. That's the new success. That's the belief you build now. And it won't come from the outside. It won't come from recognition. It won't come from being praised for surviving. It will come in a moment where you realize you didn't come this far just to perform wellness. You didn't heal this much just to become a quieter version of your old self. You're not here to be palatable. You're here to be precise. Precise with your time, precise with your words, precise with your energy, because you finally see what it costs to live diluted, and you're done paying that price. Now, you're investing in something else, in presence, in purpose, in the quiet, stubborn decision to remain faithful to what you know to be true, even when it's not easy, even when it's not popular, even when it requires solitude. Because belief, in the end, isn't a feeling. It's a structure, built brick by brick, with choices no one sees, held together by boundaries no one understands, protected by silence that no longer hides, but holds. And that silence is your new foundation. There's a kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It walks into the room, and everything shifts, not because it demands attention, but because it doesn't. That's the kind of power you begin to reclaim when you stop performing, when you stop adjusting your truth so others feel less confronted, when you stop softening your edges for the sake of being liked, because being liked is not the same as being respected, and being accepted is not the same as being seen. You've lived long enough in the gap between those things. And now you're ready to close it. This isn't a reinvention, it's a realignment, a return to your own frequency after years of static. You begin to say less but mean more. You begin to listen, not to respond, but to discern. You begin to choose not based on fear, but based on integrity. And that choice changes everything. Because now you no longer sacrifice your energy just to keep the peace. You no longer say yes out of guilt. You no longer chase understanding from people committed to misunderstanding you. That's not coldness, that's clarity. And clarity is sacred. You protect it, you honor it, you let it lead, even when it asks you to walk away from comfort, even when it asks you to sit in silence when you used to fill the air with explanation. Because now you know, explanation is often a disguise for insecurity. When you truly believe in yourself, you don't need to defend your steps. You simply take them. Grounded, intentional, complete. And those steps, they begin to rewrite your identity, not the one shaped by fear, not the one shaped by trauma, not the one shaped by what they expected you to be, but the one that always existed underneath the layers of noise. And from that identity, you stop asking, will they understand? You begin asking, am I being honest with myself? Because that question changes your entire path. It shifts your focus from reaction to responsibility, from performance to presence, from seeking permission to standing in position. This is the quiet transition that marks your return. You stop chasing, you stop convincing, you stop broadcasting your intentions to prove you're good. You know, and that knowing is enough. You walk through life without leaving pieces of yourself behind in every interaction, without exhausting yourself trying to be digestible, without shrinking to remain included. You'd rather be alone in truth than celebrated in distortion. And that is belief, not the naive kind, not the kind that needs cheerleaders, the kind that survives silence, that survives rejection, that survives the slow, painful detachment from everything you once thought you needed to be whole. You don't need fixing, you need remembering. And remembering hurts because it shows you just how long you've been away. But it also heals because it reminds you that you were never truly broken. Just buried, and now you rise. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to be busy to be valuable. You don't need to be seen to be whole. That's the lie they sold you. That visibility is proof. That noise is influence. That the more people you reach, the more real you become. But truth doesn't need an audience, it only needs a host. And when you finally become a safe place for your own truth to land, everything else becomes secondary. You stop chasing outcomes. You stop performing alignment. You stop trying to convince people that you're enough, because you finally believe it, quietly, fully, without applause. And that changes everything. You no longer force conversations. You no longer water yourself down just to be heard. You no longer wear discomfort like it's your responsibility to carry other people's reactions. Now you choose differently, not because you're guarded, but because you're awake. And being awake means you see what you used to tolerate, and you don't anymore. You notice the patterns you once normalized, the guilt that manipulated you, the kindness that was really fear in disguise. You name it, not to blame, but to reclaim. And in that naming, you grow. You begin to build a life that feels like oxygen, not obligation. And belief becomes your breath, steady, unforced, reliable. You stop negotiating with people who only engage when you're small. You stop proving to people who already decided not to see you. You stop breaking your own rhythm just to keep others close. This is what real boundaries feel like. Not walls, but gates with locks that only open from the inside, because not everyone deserves access to the version of you you fought to rebuild. Let them misunderstand, let them walk away, let them talk. You're no longer here to be interpreted. You're here to be integrated, whole, present, untouched by the chaos that once seduced you into shrinking. And in this wholeness, you no longer wait to be chosen. You choose your energy, your peace, your path. And that choice won't always be easy. There will be days where the old version of you whispers, maybe just one more compromise, maybe just a little less truth, maybe if you explain it better, but you won't, because you remember now what that compromise costs. It costs peace, it costs clarity. It costs the kind of quiet that comes only when your life is no longer a contradiction. So you choose truth, even when it shakes your voice. You choose presence, even when it means being alone. You choose alignment, even when it breaks patterns that once felt like home. Because belief is no longer a feeling you chase. It's a home you build inside yourself and guard with your life. There is a kind of peace that comes after the storm, but not because the world quieted, because you did. Not numb, not shut down, just clear. You've seen the chaos, you've lived the noise, you've bent yourself in every direction just to keep others from feeling uncomfortable. And now you're done, not bitter, not burned, just done. There's no drama in the decision, no fire, no final goodbye, only a slow, steady return to the space inside you that never needed fixing, just permission. And this permission is the most radical thing you've ever given yourself. You no longer apologize for being intense. You no longer dilute your instincts just to be digestible. You no longer carry guilt for things that were never yours to hold. You look back at who you were not with shame, but with deep, tender understanding. You did what you had to do to survive, to be loved, to stay connected, but survival is not the same as living. And love built on self-abandonment is not love. So you release the story. The one that said you must always be easygoing, agreeable, available. You're not here to be easy. You're here to be true. And truth has texture. It's not always smooth. It doesn't always land well. But it's yours. And that makes it sacred. So you begin living differently. Not louder, but deeper. You start filtering less. You start pausing more. You start noticing how often you used to rush just to avoid feeling. And now you feel. You let the moment breathe. You let discomfort speak. You let silence stretch without rescuing it, because you've learned not every space needs filling, not every question needs an answer, not every misunderstanding needs your correction. You're not here to manage perception, you're here to embody truth. And embodiment is quiet. It doesn't explain, it doesn't beg, it simply is. This is the new way. Not one of performance, but presence. Not one of approval, but alignment. Not one of seeking, but standing. You walk into rooms with nothing to prove. You leave conversations without unfinished sentences in your chest. You make decisions that don't require validation to feel complete. Because belief has settled in your bones, not as arrogance, but as knowing. You know who you are. You know what you're not. You know what you'll never trade again just to be included. You stop asking, what do they think of me? And start asking, am I in integrity with myself? And when the answer is yes, you rest. Not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer in conflict with your own soul. And that's the rarest kind of peace, the kind that doesn't waver when they don't get you, the kind that doesn't shatter when you walk alone, the kind that holds when the world questions the path only you were born to walk. So walk it, not faster, not louder, just fully. This is your return, not to who you were, but to who you've always been beneath the silence. There is a silence that feels like absence, and there is a silence that feels like arrival. You know the difference now, because you've lived both. You've sat in the silence that echoed with guilt. You've endured the silence that came from swallowing words. You've worn the silence that followed self-betrayal. But this is different. This is the silence that comes when nothing more needs to be proven. The silence of completion, of return, of inner command. Because you've crossed the hardest distance, not miles, but the gap between who you were told to be and who you actually are. And standing here now, you're not interested in rebuilding the old. You're not interested in fixing a version of yourself that was never yours to begin with. Now you build forward, from depth, from alignment, from the still grounded knowing that your existence doesn't require decoration to have value. You no longer reach for connection that costs clarity. You no longer explain decisions rooted in peace. You no longer carry the weight of other people's inability to meet you. Let them stay where they are. You're not abandoning anyone. You're just refusing to abandon yourself again. And in that refusal, a new chapter opens. One that's not about fixing, but feeling. Not about chasing, but choosing. Not about surviving, but standing. You begin to realize that everything you were looking for in approval, in noise, in motion, was always meant to be cultivated in silence. Because silence doesn't mean absence. It means presence without explanation. You're no longer available for conversations that twist your truth. You're no longer drawn to spaces that reward your absence. You're no longer willing to live in a way that demands you stay small to stay included. This is the evolution, from appeasing to aligning, from pleasing to protecting, from shrinking to standing. And yes, it will feel unfamiliar, unnatural even, because self-abandonment was your comfort zone. You made it look graceful. You wore it like humility, but it was a slow death, and you finally said no. And that no was the first step back to belief. Not belief in success, not belief in perfection, but belief in your own voice, your own rhythm, your own enoughness. You'll lose people here, you'll lose patterns. You'll lose a version of you that was built to survive but never allowed to be. Let it fall, let it die, let it clear the space for what's real, because now you live differently, not to prove, not to perform, but to protect your own alignment with something deeper than opinion, something sacred, yourself. You no longer owe the world a version of you that doesn't feel like home. That sentence alone can change everything, because you've spent years renting your identity to expectations, smiling when you were drowning, agreeing when your soul recoiled, staying quiet because the price of being real seemed too high. But what they never told you is, the price of being false is even higher. It's not paid all at once. It's paid in parts of you you never get back, in the hesitation before you speak, in the weight in your chest after every dishonest yes, in the numbness that eventually replaces wonder. And now that you've tasted truth, even just a drop, you can't go back. Because pretending is no longer survival, it's suffocation. You've outgrown the need to be approved at the cost of your alignment. You've outgrown roles where your silence was mistaken for peace, where your exhaustion was labeled loyalty, where your presence was only valued when it came without boundaries. So now you move different. You speak slower, you choose better, you walk away faster, not because you've hardened, but because you've healed. And healing doesn't make you soft. It makes you honest, it makes you protective, it makes you careful about what you allow near your center. This is sacred ground now. Not everyone gets access, not every energy gets invited, because you're no longer building a life that looks good from the outside but feels hollow within. You're no longer sacrificing peace for performance or clarity for connection. You've redefined what it means to be strong. It's not in your ability to endure. It's in your courage to exit. To exit what depletes you. To exit what confuses your spirit. To exit what asks you to be less in order to be loved. Let them call it distance. Let them call it ego. Let them call it change. You call it return. The return to yourself, to stillness, to inner structure, to the silent authority that doesn't need to shout to be known. Because belief, the kind that holds even when everything else falls, lives in simplicity, in one clean line drawn, in one truth spoken without apology, in one morning where you wake up and no longer feel the ache of living against yourself. That is what you're here for now, not to be understood by the world, but to be at peace with the voice inside that never stopped calling you back. And the further you walk in truth, the more natural it feels. The less you crave correction, the less you chase closure, the less you explain your choices to people who were never meant to carry your truth. And that is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, the freedom to be exactly who you are, without resistance, without disguise, without permission. There comes a day when silence isn't heavy anymore. It's not loneliness, it's not absence, it's presence. Without distortion, you sit with yourself, and for the first time in years you don't flinch. You don't scan for flaws, you don't rush to distract, you just breathe and realize you're home. Not in a destination, not in a role, not in someone else's arms, but in yourself. And that self is no longer fragmented, no longer bending at every sharp edge, no longer leaking energy through apologies you didn't owe, no longer handing out pieces just to be seen. You're whole. And wholeness doesn't mean perfect. It means nothing essential is being abandoned anymore. You've stopped sacrificing your peace for someone else's comfort. You've stopped negotiating with guilt like it's part of your moral compass. You've stopped pretending you don't feel things deeply just to survive in a shallow world. You feel it all now. The pain, the love, the weight of your own truth, and still you stay. That staying, that loyalty to self, is belief in its purest form. Because belief isn't a mindset, it's not a mantra, it's the architecture of how you live. It's how you speak to yourself in the quiet moments. It's how you protect your soul when no one's watching. It's how you respond when your old habits knock, asking for just one more compromise. And now you no longer answer the door, not out of pride, but out of reverence. You've finally learned that what you tolerate teaches the world how to treat you. And more importantly, how you treat yourself. So now you're deliberate, not rushed, not reactive. Deliberate with your time, with your presence, with your energy. You don't chase anymore. Because you've realized everything that pulls you away from yourself is too expensive, and now you don't pay that price. You sit in the quiet, not because there's nothing to say, but because there's nothing left to prove. The old you would have filled the silence, would have reached out, would have asked for validation. But now you watch, you wait, you protect, you live with structure that doesn't shake just because someone else is uncomfortable. You're not here to be misunderstood forever, but you're not here to spend your life clarifying your essence either. Let your clarity offend. Let your peace disrupt. Let your silence speak louder than your past ever could. Because you didn't come this far to return to who you were. You came this far to become someone who no longer folds under pressure, who no longer abandons truth in exchange for attention, who no longer fears the sound of their own stillness. You are that person now. Not arriving, not becoming, but being, no noise, no need, just presence. And that's the final truth you were meant to remember. The mirror is still there, same glass, same frame, same light falling across your face. But something has changed. Not in the reflection, but in the one who chooses to stand still and meet it. No more flinching, no more scanning for faults, no more looking for evidence that you're not enough. Now you look and see not perfection, but presence. Not flawlessness, but fullness. A life no longer lived in reaction to fear, a voice no longer shaped by the need to be understood, a soul no longer contorted for temporary comfort. You've stopped explaining, you've stopped performing, you've stopped narrating your value to people too distracted to listen. You didn't lose anything, you reclaimed everything. What was scattered is now gathered. What was hidden is now honored. What was denied is now embodied. And that embodiment, it's quiet. It doesn't fight, it doesn't ask, it simply is. You've remembered how to stand, not as a posture, but as a truth. And that truth is unshakable, because it no longer relies on someone else's response to feel real. You don't need to be explained to be legitimate. You don't need to be validated to be worthy. You don't need to be seen to know you exist. You exist. Fully, clearly, here. And maybe the world is still loud, still confused, still pulling at you to return to the familiar roles, the agreeable version, the quiet presence, the accommodating self. But you won't go back, not because you're better, but because you're different, aligned, rooted, free. You walk slower now. You choose lighter now. You say less, but everything you say lands with weight, because it comes from a place that no longer shakes. You've become the calm you used to search for. You've become the depth you used to chase in others. You've become the silence that no longer hides, but holds. This silence is your command. It's your clarity. It's your return. So if anyone asks, why are you so different now? Let them ask. You don't need to answer. You've already answered. In the way you walk, in the way you no longer chase, in the way your eyes hold without apology. This is what it means to believe again. Not in outcomes, not in promises, not in someone else's idea of who you should be, but in yourself, as you are, here. Now whole. The world may still talk, let it. Your life has become the proof, your breath, the return, your silence, the final word. The mirror is still there. Same glass, same frame, same light falling across your face. But something has changed, not in the reflection, but in the one who chooses to stand still and meet it. No more flinching, no more scanning for faults, no more looking for evidence that you're not enough. Now, you look and see not perfection, but presence. Not flawlessness, but fullness. A life no longer lived in reaction to fear. A voice no longer shaped by the need to be understood. A soul no longer contorted for temporary comfort. You've stopped explaining. You've stopped performing. You've stopped narrating your value to people too distracted to listen. You didn't lose anything. You reclaimed everything. What was scattered is now gathered. What was hidden is now honored. What was denied is now embodied. And that embodiment, it's quiet. It doesn't fight. It doesn't ask. It simply is. You've remembered how to stand, not as a posture, but as a truth. And that truth is unshakable, because it no longer relies on someone else's response to feel real. You don't need to be explained to be legitimate. You don't need to be validated to be worthy. You don't need to be seen to know you exist. You exist, fully, clearly, here. And maybe the world is still loud, still confused, still pulling at you to return to the familiar roles, the agreeable version, the quiet presence, the accommodating self. But you won't go back. Not because you're better, but because you're different. Aligned, rooted, free. You walk slower now. You choose lighter now. You say less. But everything you say lands with weight, because it comes from a place that no longer shakes. You've become the calm you used to search for. You've become the depth you used to chase in others. You've become the silence that no longer hides, but holds. This silence is your command, it's your clarity, it's your return. So if anyone asks, why are you so different now? Let them ask. You don't need to answer. You've already answered in the way you walk, in the way you no longer chase, in the way your eyes hold without apology. This is what it means to believe again, not in outcomes, not in promises, not in someone else's idea of who you should be, but in yourself, as you are, here. Now, whole. The world may still talk, let it. Your life has become the proof, your breath, the return, your silence, the final word. And if something in you echoed, leave a sign below. You don't need to explain it. Just a point, a breath. A quiet signal that you're also here, still, listening, awake.